Clara lived in a small, dusty town of the Wild West where the sun always seemed to burn too bright and the nights felt too long. The town was built from wood and sweat, with a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a few houses, and the wide, endless desert stretching in every direction. It was a place where people came chasing gold or cattle, and most left broken or hard-hearted. For Clara, this town was not a dream, but a place where she tried each day to survive with her little daughter, Mary. She had once known happiness. Years ago, she had a husband, a man who played his guitar by the fire and told her stories under the stars. But life in the West was cruel. He had fallen sick during the cold season and never recovered. Clara buried him under a lone tree by the river. Since that day, her life had changed. She worked wherever she could, cleaning the saloon, serving strangers, and sometimes stitching clothes for the women of the town. But money was never enough, and respect was something she had stopped expecting. Most people saw her as just another poor widow with a child. When she carried water from the well, men laughed at her bent back. When she walked through the street with Mary, some women whispered behind her. But Clara had learned to keep her head low and her heart closed. Her only joy was Mary, who ran barefoot on the dusty roads, chasing butterflies and laughing as if the world was still kind. Mary was 7 years old, with eyes as bright as the summer sky and hair the color of wheat. She often asked her mother about her father, and Clara always told her the same thing, that he had been brave and gentle. Mary would smile and say that she wanted to meet someone brave one day. Clara never said it aloud, but she feared her daughter might never see true kindness in a place where greed and pride ruled. One afternoon, the town seemed the same as always. The men sat outside the saloon with their whiskey glasses, spitting tobacco and talking about cattle prices. Horses stood tied to the posts, their tails swishing against the flies. The sheriff strolled lazily by, his hat pulled down to hide from the sun. Clara was struggling with 2 heavy buckets of water, trying to carry them home while Mary walked beside her, holding on to her mother's dress. As she bent down to rest the buckets, a shadow fell across her. She looked up and saw a stranger. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dust on his boots and a coat that had seen many roads. His face was weathered, his beard rough, but his eyes were steady and calm. He was not like the others who laughed at her weakness. He simply tipped his hat and asked if she needed help. For a moment, Clara did not know how to answer. No man in town had spoken to her with respect in a long time. She shook her head politely, but the stranger reached down, lifted one bucket with ease, and walked beside her. Mary looked at him with wide eyes, curious but unafraid. Clara noticed something unusual about him. He did not look around for praise, nor did he make a joke. He just walked quietly, as if helping her was the most natural thing in the world. When they reached her small home, a simple cabin with a broken fence, Clara thanked him softly. He nodded, placed the bucket by her door, and said, "Name's Daniel." Then he turned to leave. Clara stood there watching him go, wondering why such a man had chosen to help a woman like her. Mary tugged at her hand and whispered, "Mama, is he brave?" Clara smiled faintly but said nothing. The next few days, Clara noticed Daniel more often. He spent time at the blacksmith shop fixing his horse's saddle or sharpening tools. Sometimes he sat alone by the well, drinking water, his eyes fixed on the desert horizon as if waiting for something. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were kind. He never joined the loud laughter of the saloon men, nor did he mock anyone. To Clara, he was a mystery. To Mary, he was fascinating. But even with Daniel around, Clara did not allow her heart to hope too much. She reminded herself that strangers came and went, and kindness in the West was often just a mask. Still, there was something about the way Daniel carried himself that made her feel he had lived through storms of his own. His silence spoke louder than words, and his presence made her feel strangely safe. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in shades of red and gold, Clara sat outside her cabin watching Mary play with a rag doll. Daniel walked by and tipped his hat again. Mary ran up to him without fear and asked if he had ever seen a storm. Daniel knelt down, his eyes soft, and told her about a sandstorm he had once faced in Texas. He said the wind had been so strong it felt like knives cutting across the skin, and the sand had covered everything until the world turned dark. Mary listened with wide eyes, gripping her doll tightly. Clara listened too, her heart beating faster. After that evening, Clara could not stop thinking about his words. She knew storms in the desert could be deadly. She had lived through small ones, but the way Daniel described it made her realize how powerless humans were against nature. She prayed that she and Mary would never be caught in such a storm. Life in the town went on, but the desert was restless. Winds grew stronger and the sky often carried strange colors. The elders whispered that a big storm was coming, the kind that swallowed everything in its path. Clara heard the whispers but tried not to worry Mary. Yet inside her heart, she felt fear. On Sunday, when the church bells rang faintly in the wind, Clara decided to take Mary out to gather wild herbs near the edge of the desert. It was something they often did together. She packed a small basket and held Mary's hand as they walked past the last houses of the town into the open land. Daniel, sitting outside the blacksmith's shop, noticed them walking away. He looked up at the sky and saw the clouds rolling faster than usual. His jaw tightened. He had seen signs like this before. He knew danger was near. Clara, unaware of the storm building, hummed a soft tune as Mary skipped beside her, picking flowers and laughing. The air felt heavy, but she ignored it. She wanted her daughter to enjoy the little joys of life, even if the world around them was harsh. Mary bent down to pick a bright yellow flower and proudly showed it to her mother. Clara smiled and tucked it behind Mary's ear. For a moment, life felt peaceful, almost normal. But far behind them, Daniel rose from his seat. He could not take his eyes off the sky. The winds were shifting, the horizon already blurring. He knew that if they stayed out there too long, they would not return safely. He tightened the strap of his coat, glanced once at his horse, and whispered under his breath, "Not again. Not this time." What Clara didn't know was that her life was about to change forever. She had never known compassion, never believed a man would risk his life for her or her daughter, but the desert was about to test them all. The storm was coming, and in the heart of that storm, Daniel would show her what true bravery looked like. The air was strange that Sunday afternoon, heavy and dry, as if the desert was holding its breath. Clara and Mary had wandered further than usual, their small basket filling with herbs and flowers. Clara tried to enjoy the quiet time with her daughter, but she could not shake the feeling that something was unsettled in the sky. The light seemed sharper, the clouds moving faster, though the sun still burned bright above them. Back in town, Daniel sat outside the blacksmith's shop, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. He looked at the horizon again and his chest tightened. The desert was no stranger to him. He had lived through years of storms, cattle drives, and lonely trails. He knew when the land was warning him. The clouds were thickening, their shapes twisting as the wind began to shift. Sand lifted in small swirls at his feet. To others, it might have seemed like nothing, but to Daniel it was a sign of something much greater. He looked toward the edge of town and saw Clara and Mary as tiny figures against the wide open land. His heart moved before his mind did. He stood, sheathed his knife, and headed to the stable. Men on the porch of the saloon called after him, asking where he was going in such a hurry. Daniel didn't answer. He saddled his horse quickly, his hands firm, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. Out in the open desert, Clara finally felt the first lash of the wind. It came suddenly, pulling her bonnet back and tossing Mary's hair across her face. Mary giggled at first, but Clara's smile faded when she saw the sky behind them begin to blur with a wall of dust. The sound followed next, a deep, growing roar like thunder rolling across the earth. Clara grabbed Mary's hand tightly and whispered for her to stay close. The storm was coming. The wind grew harsher with each step they tried to take back toward town. Clara's skirt whipped around her legs and the herbs in their basket scattered into the air. Mary's laughter turned into frightened cries as the sand began to sting her cheeks. Clara lifted her in her arms, clutching her tight as she stumbled forward. But the storm was quicker. It rolled over the desert like a giant beast, swallowing the horizon and everything in its path. Back in town, doors were slamming shut and shutters pulled tight. People shouted warnings and ran for cover. The saloon men cursed, saying only a fool would be caught outside in such a storm. But Daniel was already riding hard, his horse pushing against the wind, hooves pounding into the dirt. He leaned low, urging the animal forward, his coat flapping wildly. Sand whipped into his face, but he didn't stop. Somewhere out there was Clara and her child, and he wasn't about to let the desert claim them. The storm hit Clara and Mary with full force. The air turned thick with sand, cutting their skin and choking their lungs. Clara tried to shield Mary with her body, but it felt like needles tearing at her arms and face. She could hardly see a few steps ahead. Her eyes burned, her throat filled with dust and her legs weakened under the weight of both the storm and her daughter. Mary clung to her, crying, "Mama, I can't breathe." Clara shouted back words of comfort, though her voice was nearly stolen by the wind. She stumbled toward a low bush and crouched behind it, trying to shield Mary from the worst of the storm. Her heart pounded with fear. She had lived through hardships before, but never had she felt so powerless. She thought of her husband's grave and whispered a prayer that at least Mary would survive. Daniel pressed deeper into the storm, his horse struggling to push against the wall of sand. The wind roared in his ears, drowning every sound. He pulled the reins hard and slid from the saddle, realizing the animal could go no further. He slapped the horse on its flank, sending it back toward town, and moved forward on foot. He wrapped his bandana tighter around his mouth and nose, bent low to the ground, and searched for any sign of them. The sand was everywhere, blinding, endless. He could barely make out shapes, but he kept calling out, his deep voice carrying through the storm. "Clara! Mary!" He knew they might not hear him, but he couldn't stop. Each step sank into the soft sand. Each breath burned his lungs, but his mind held one picture. Mary's small face, frightened and lost in the storm. Clara heard something through the roar. At first she thought it was her imagination, but then it came again, steady and strong. A man's voice calling their names. Her heart leaped. She pulled Mary close and shouted with all the strength left in her, "Here! We're here!" Her voice cracked, but she screamed again. Daniel caught the faint sound and pushed toward it. His eyes stung, his lips were cracked, but he didn't stop. Finally, through the thick veil of sand, he saw a small figure curled on the ground. Mary. Her tiny hands were over her face, trying to shield herself. Clara was nearby, clutching onto a bush, her body trembling from exhaustion. Without hesitation, Daniel rushed forward and lifted Mary into his arms. She was light. Too light. Her breaths shallow and broken with sobs. He wrapped his coat around her, shielding her small body from the sand, and looked at Clara. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and tears, but when she saw Mary safe in his arms, she let out a sob of relief that nearly broke his heart. Daniel shouted over the wind, "Stay close to me." He pulled Clara up, tied his rope around her waist, and fastened the other end to his own belt. He shifted Mary against his chest, holding her tight as if she were his own child. The storm screamed around them, but he led the way, forcing his body through the waves of dust and wind. Every step was a battle. Clara stumbled behind him, holding onto the rope, her strength fading, but Daniel never slowed. His boots dug into the sand, his body shielding Mary, his will stronger than the storm itself. He knew if they stopped even for a moment, they might never rise again. Back in town, people peered through cracks in their shutters, wondering if the stranger had been lost to the desert. The sheriff muttered that no man could fight such a storm and survive. But Clara and Mary's neighbors, who had seen them leave earlier, stood at the edge of the street, their hearts heavy with worry. Then, through the wall of dust, a shape appeared. First faint, then clearer. Daniel staggered into sight, his coat torn, his face bleeding from the sand, but Mary was still in his arms, alive. Clara stumbled behind him, clinging to the rope, her dress ripped, her face streaked with tears. The townsfolk gasped. Some ran forward with blankets, others with water. Daniel dropped to his knees, lowering Mary gently into Clara's arms. His chest heaved, his breath ragged, but his eyes shone with quiet triumph. Clara held Mary close, sobbing, whispering her daughter's name over and over as if she could never let go. For the first time in her life, Clara felt what compassion truly was. A man had risked everything, not for money, not for glory, but for her and her child. As she looked at Daniel, battered and weary, she knew her world had changed forever. The storm was not ready to let them go. Even as Daniel held Mary close and Clara struggled behind him, the desert wind roared like a wild beast. The sky had turned into a thick curtain of brown and gray, swallowing light and hope. Sand cut across their faces like sharp glass, and the ground felt unsteady beneath their feet. Clara's heart raced as she stumbled forward, tied to Daniel by the rope, afraid that one wrong step would tear her away into the storm. Her arms ached, her legs trembled, and fear weighed heavy on her chest. She could not see more than a few feet ahead, but she clung to the rope with all her strength, trusting the man who led the way. Daniel moved like someone who had fought storms before. He bent low, shielding Mary under his coat, his body a wall against the desert's fury. His boots sank into the soft sand, but he pushed forward without hesitation. His voice cut through the storm again and again, steady and commanding. "Stay close. Don't let go!" Clara answered with a weak cry, but her voice was lost in the roar. Her throat burned with dust, her eyes stung, and her lungs screamed for air. She thought she might collapse, but each time she faltered, she saw Daniel's silhouette through the storm, strong and unshaken. That sight gave her strength. Mary stirred in Daniel's arms, her small fingers clutching at his coat. She coughed softly, her breath shallow, but she was alive. Daniel glanced down at her, his eyes softening even in the chaos. "You'll be fine, little one," he whispered, though only the wind could hear his words. He had no child of his own, but at that moment he carried Mary as if she were his blood. Clara remembered the moment she saw Daniel appear through the wall of sand. She had thought it was the end for her and her daughter. Her body was numb, her spirit broken, yet suddenly there he was, this man she barely knew, risking his life for theirs. She had never witnessed such courage, not even from her late husband. He had been kind, yes, but this was different. This was pure selflessness, a man giving everything for strangers. The realization brought tears to her eyes, mixing with the sand that cut her cheeks. The storm grew wilder, its howl like the cry of 1,000 wolves. Daniel searched for landmarks, for anything to guide them back to town. But the world was a blur of dust and darkness. His mind worked quickly, recalling the land he had crossed so many times. He knew there was a ridge of rocks to the east, a natural shield against the wind. If they could reach it, they might find a brief shelter before continuing. Almost there, he shouted back to Clara, though he wasn't sure she heard. He shifted Mary against his chest and tightened his grip on the rope. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but he pushed forward. He had promised himself long ago that he would never let another innocent soul be lost to the desert if he could prevent it. Finally, through the swirling storm, the outline of jagged rocks appeared. Daniel guided them toward it, each step a battle. The rocks broke the wind slightly, giving them a moment of relief. Clara collapsed to her knees behind the shelter, gasping for air, clutching the rope as if it were her lifeline. Mary whimpered softly in Daniel's arms, her small body trembling. Daniel crouched down, shielding them both with his broad frame. He removed his bandana for a moment and pressed it against Mary's face to help her breathe cleaner air. Clara looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You found her. You saved her." Daniel's face was scratched and bleeding from the sand, but his expression was calm. He nodded once, his voice low but firm. "I told you I would." The storm raged on, shaking the rocks, but inside that small shelter, Clara felt something she had never known before: safety. Not because the storm had weakened, but because of the man before her. For years she had believed compassion was just a word, a promise people spoke but never lived. Yet here it was, alive and real, in the actions of a stranger who owed her nothing. Clara reached for Mary, holding her close as Daniel carefully transferred the child into her arms. Mary's face was streaked with dust, her small lips dry, but when she saw her mother, she smiled faintly, whispering, "Mama." That single word filled Clara's heart with both relief and gratitude. She kissed her daughter's forehead again and again, whispering prayers of thanks. Daniel sat with his back against the rock, catching his breath. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the storm. He knew they could not stay there forever. The storm might last hours, maybe longer, and they needed to reach town. He thought of the townsfolk, safe behind their shuttered windows, unaware of the struggle happening out here. A part of him wondered if they would even care. But for Clara and Mary, he would fight until the last of his strength was gone. Clara glanced at him through the dim light. She wanted to speak, to thank him properly, but her throat was raw from the sand. Instead, she simply looked at him with eyes that said more than words ever could. Daniel met her gaze for a brief moment, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a bond forged in fire, or in this case, the fury of the desert. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for the worst of the storm to pass. Daniel finally stood, tightening the rope around his waist again. "We move," he said firmly. Clara nodded, though her legs still trembled. She tied Mary close against her chest with part of her shawl, freeing her hands to grip the rope better. Daniel stepped out from behind the rocks, testing the wind. It was still fierce, but slightly weaker than before. He motioned for Clara to follow. Together they pushed forward once more, Each step was painful, but now Clara felt a new strength. She was not alone anymore. With Daniel leading, she believed they could survive. The journey back was slow, every footstep a victory. Clara stumbled many times, but each time Daniel pulled her forward, never letting the rope slacken. The storm fought them, clawed at them, but Daniel's determination never broke. His voice guided them, strong and steady, a lighthouse in the darkness. At last, through the veil of dust, Clara saw the faint outline of the town. Her heart leaped with hope. Daniel pressed on harder, his boots dragging but his grip firm. The sound of voices reached them, shouts from the townsfolk who had gathered at the edge of the street, straining their eyes to see if the stranger had survived. When they finally stumbled into town, Daniel's body was torn and bleeding, but Mary was safe in his arms once more. Clara, her face streaked with tears and dust, clung to his side. The people gasped, some rushing forward with blankets and water. The sheriff himself looked stunned, his hat in his hand. Clara fell to her knees, holding Mary tightly, sobbing with relief. She lifted her eyes to Daniel, who stood above them, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with quiet strength. In that moment, she knew her life would never be the same. For the first time, she had seen compassion, not in words, but in action, and it had saved the most precious thing in her world. The storm did not calm quickly. Even as Daniel led Clara and Mary back into the town, the air was still thick with dust, and the wind clawed at every corner. People rushed to close their doors again, yet many still stood in awe at the sight of the stranger returning with the mother and child. Few had expected them to survive, and even fewer had believed that Daniel would risk his own life for them. Daniel staggered forward, his boots heavy with sand, his face torn with scratches. He carried Mary against his chest until the very last step, as if the child weighed nothing at all. Clara stumbled behind him, still tied to the rope, her hands raw but her heart bursting with relief. When they finally crossed into the safety of the main street, the townsfolk surrounded them, shouting for water, blankets, and bandages. Daniel lowered Mary gently into Clara's arms. For a moment, Clara could not let go. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, whispering her name over and over as if she were afraid Mary might slip away again. Mary clung to her mother's neck, her tiny body trembling, her face streaked with dust and tears. But her eyes were open and she was alive. Clara's sobs broke the silence of the crowd, raw and grateful. Daniel dropped to one knee, his strength drained. He pulled the bandana from his face, coughing hard as he tried to clear the dust from his lungs. His hands were bleeding where the rope had cut him, and his coat was torn in several places. Yet when his eyes lifted, there was no pride, no boast, only quiet relief that the child was safe. The sheriff stepped forward, removing his hat. He looked at Daniel with something close to respect, though his voice carried a trace of shame. That storm should have taken all of you. I've seen less men fall for less reason. You brought them back. Daniel gave a small nod, too tired to answer with more. He leaned back against a post as someone handed him water. He drank slowly, his hands shaking, but his eyes never left Clara and Mary. Clara, seeing his condition, wanted to go to him but could not yet let go of her daughter. Instead, she whispered to Mary, "Look at him, darling. That's the man who saved us." Mary peeked over her mother's shoulder and gave a small, tired smile, whispering, "He's brave, Mama, just like you said." Clara felt her heart break and mend all at once. She had told Mary once that her father had been brave, but now, in this moment, she realized Mary had witnessed true bravery with her own eyes. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed voices. Some called Daniel a fool for riding into the storm, but others shook their heads, saying no one else in town would have had the courage. Slowly, their whispers turned into quiet admiration. Mothers held their children tighter, men tipped their hats, and women wiped tears from their cheeks. For years, Clara had been overlooked, pitied or judged, but because of Daniel's act, she now stood in the center of the town with every eye on her, not in scorn, but in respect. The blacksmith's wife brought blankets, wrapping them around Clara and Mary. Another woman carried warm broth, pressing it into Clara's hands. For the first time in years, the townsfolk treated her with kindness. She knew it was not because of her alone, but because of what Daniel had done. Daniel tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. His legs shook and he sank back to the ground. Clara, still holding Mary, moved quickly to his side. She placed her daughter down on a blanket and knelt beside Daniel, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. "Please," she whispered, "rest. You've done enough. Daniel gave her a tired smile. She's safe. That's all that matters. His voice was rough, nearly swallowed by the sound of the wind still rushing through the streets. Clara felt tears sting her eyes again. She had heard many men speak in her life, but none had ever spoken words that carried so much truth. The doctor was called, and he inspected Daniel's wounds. They were not deep, but the storm had left his skin raw, his lungs full of dust and his body exhausted. He was taken to a small cabin near the edge of town where he could rest. Clara wanted to stay with him, but Mary clung to her, too frightened to be apart. Yet in her heart, Clara promised she would see him again. That night the storm finally passed. The desert lay still once more, though the ground was scarred by the fury of the wind. The sky cleared to reveal 1,000 stars shining cold and bright above the small town. Inside her cabin, Clara lay awake, Mary asleep in her arms. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in her mind. She saw again the wall of sand, the hopelessness, and then the silhouette of Daniel appearing through the storm like an answer to prayer. She thought of the moment he placed Mary into her arms, his voice soft but steady. She whispered into the quiet room, though no one could hear her. I had never seen compassion. Not until today. The next morning, Clara prepared a small basket with bread, broth, and herbs. Mary insisted on picking a flower to add to it, saying, "It's for the brave man." Clara smiled softly and tucked the flower in carefully. Together they walked to the cabin where Daniel rested. When she knocked gently on the door, the doctor opened it and smiled. "He's awake, a little weak but stubborn as ever." Clara entered, holding Mary's hand. Daniel sat on a simple chair, his back straight, though his face still carried the weariness of the storm. His eyes lifted when he saw them, and a quiet warmth filled his expression. Mary ran forward first, holding out the flower with both hands. "This is for you. Mama says you saved me." Daniel took the flower gently, his large hand almost swallowing it, but he held it as if it were the most precious gift he had ever received. "Thank you, little one," he said softly. Clara set the basket down and met his gaze. For a long moment she said nothing. Words seemed too small for the weight of what she felt. Finally, her voice trembled as she whispered, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back hope." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You owe me nothing. I did what anyone should have done." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not from fear. They were from gratitude. She knew in her heart that not everyone would have done what he did. In fact, she doubted anyone else in town would have stepped into that storm. Only him. As Mary sat at Daniel's feet, humming softly to herself, Clara watched them both and felt something stir within her that she had thought was long dead. Trust. Safety. A small spark of hope that life could be gentler than she had believed. She did not know what the future held, but she knew one truth with all her heart. Compassion had found her in the form of a brave man who had carried her daughter out of a storm. The desert looked calm after the storm, as if nothing had ever happened. The sky was bright again, the wind gentle, and the town returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet for Clara, everything had changed. She walked through the streets with Mary holding her hand, and for the first time people greeted her with kindness. The blacksmith tipped his hat, the sheriff nodded with respect, and the saloon women smiled warmly. Clara was not used to such attention, but she knew why it was happening. Daniel's bravery had opened their eyes. Still, Clara's heart was restless. She could not stop thinking of Daniel, resting alone in his cabin. She remembered how his body shook with exhaustion as he handed Mary back to her, how his face bled from the storm yet carried no complaint. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw him shielding Mary under his coat, his broad shoulders pushing against the desert's fury. She wanted to thank him again, not with words this time, but with care. One evening, Clara baked bread and prepared a stew. Mary picked a handful of wildflowers and insisted they bring them to Daniel. Together they walked to his cabin. When Daniel opened the door, he looked surprised but pleased. His wounds were healing, though his hands were still rough and red. Clara placed the food on the table, while Mary ran to place the flowers in a tin cup by the window. Daniel watched them quietly, his eyes soft, his lips forming the faintest smile. "Mary wanted you to have these," Clara said, her voice gentle. "And I wanted to thank you again. I don't think I'll ever find enough words for what you did." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You don't need words. Your daughter's laughter is thanks enough." Mary giggled at that moment, spinning around with her rag doll, and Clara felt her heart ache with gratitude. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time she saw not just a stranger but a man who carried kindness like a hidden treasure. Days passed and Daniel grew stronger. He began helping around town, fixing fences, repairing saddles, and even helping the storekeeper unload heavy barrels. The townsfolk, once skeptical, started trusting him. Children followed him with wide eyes and men nodded respectfully when he walked by. Clara noticed how he never asked for payment beyond a meal or a bed of hay for his horse. He worked quietly, spoke little, and carried himself with humility. Mary adored him. She followed him everywhere, asking endless questions about horses, storms, and the world beyond the desert. Daniel always answered patiently, sometimes kneeling down to her level so she felt important. Clara watched these moments with quiet amazement. She had thought her daughter would grow up without knowing what true compassion looked like. But now Mary had someone to look up to. One evening, Clara sat outside her cabin, watching the sun sink into the horizon. The desert glowed red and gold as if painted by fire. Daniel approached, carrying a small sack of flour he had fetched from the store. He placed it by her door and stood for a moment gazing at the same sunset. Clara hesitated, then spoke softly. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you risk your life for us? You could have stayed safe like everyone else." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he looked at the sky. His voice was low, steady, filled with weight. "Years ago in Texas, I lost someone in a storm. I was too late. I swore I'd never let it happen again if I could stop it." He paused, his eyes clouded with memory. "When I saw you and your daughter walk into that desert, I knew I couldn't stand by. I couldn't live with myself if I did." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to ease the sorrow she heard in his voice, but she held her hands together in her lap. "Then maybe God sent you here," she whispered. "Maybe he knew we needed you." Daniel turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy yet comforting, like a bond that needed no words. Life in town slowly returned to normal, but Clara's life no longer felt ordinary. She noticed the way people treated her differently now. They offered her help with water, greeted Mary kindly, and even invited her to gatherings. Yet the greatest change was inside her heart. For years, she had lived as if kindness was something meant for other people, never for her. Now, because of Daniel, she believed again in goodness. One morning, Clara walked with Mary through the market. Mary carried a small toy horse Daniel had carved for her. The sheriff stopped them and said, "You've got a good man watching over you now." Clara blushed, unsure how to reply, but inside she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. That evening, Clara found herself standing outside Daniel's cabin once more. She held Mary's hand, but this time she had not come with food or flowers. She had come simply to see him. Daniel opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of them. Mary ran inside without hesitation, as if it were her second home. Clara followed slowly, her heart beating fast. Daniel poured water for her, and they sat together in the quiet cabin while Mary hummed to herself in the corner. Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. "You changed everything," she said quietly. "Not just by saving us, but by showing me that compassion is real. I thought I'd never see it again." Daniel met her gaze, his voice steady but tender. "Sometimes we have to walk through storms to find what really matters." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of healing, of hope. She reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over his. He did not pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, rough but warm. Mary looked up from her toy horse and smiled. "Mama, are we safe now?" Clara smiled back, her heart full. "Yes, darling. We're safe." She looked at Daniel as she spoke, knowing it was the truth. From that day on, Daniel became a part of their lives. He was not loud or boastful, but his presence was steady, like the desert mountains that never moved. For Clara, it felt as though the storm had given her more than it had taken. It had tested her, nearly broken her, but in the heart of that fury, she had found compassion and courage she had never known. As weeks turned to months, the memory of the storm remained, but so did the memory of Daniel's arms carrying Mary through the darkness. Clara often thought of how close she had come to losing everything, and how one man's choice had rewritten her story. Under the endless desert sky, where the stars shone like eternal fires, Clara knew her life had been changed forever. She had seen compassion with her own eyes in the form of a brave man who walked into a storm for her daughter. And though storms would come again, she no longer faced them alone.